I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq to introduce an address by the head of state.
السيد الرئيس المحترم أصحاب السعادة.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of presenting to you a statement from His Excellency the Presidency of the Republic of Iraq, Mr. Barham Salih, at the general debate of the 75th session of the General Assembly. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the Clement and the Merciful. President, Secretary General, Majesties, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to convey to you our greetings of peace, greetings which come from the city of peace, Baghdad. I am delighted at the outset to greet you on behalf of the Republic of Iraq, a founding country of the United Nations. I wish the General Assembly every success in its current session. It is the first time in the history of the United Nations that the General Assembly is meeting virtually. This is a consequence of the pandemic we're facing currently, that is the COVID-19 pandemic, a cross-border threat which threatens our life, our ways of life, our economies, and our societies in the most general terms. This virtual meeting is the symbol of radical change in our ways of life and in the ways we communicate. We are in the midst of a historic paradox indeed, and that is the fact that we continue to communicate and to meet at the time we're called upon to socially distance. So yes, we are hindered by the pandemic, but let us communicate, born of our will to coexist and communicate. The pandemic is ravaging all of our villages across the globe and is a danger for the whole world. And this fact compels us to give full form to the principles of solidarity and cooperation between our peoples and societies, whatever the differences may be that separate us, and that in order to eradicate the pandemic, or at least to stem its effects. It also behooves the most developed nations among us to cooperate by exchanging experience and information in order to combat the pandemic. These developed nations must afford assistance to developing nations in order to create a healthy environment which makes it possible to fight against the pandemic and to limit the harmful effects of it on our societies and our lives. Moreover, we are all responsible for fighting against misinformation related to the pandemic. Indeed, ignorance and misinformation jeopardize the lives of millions of our people. Early planning plays a crucial role in guaranteeing equity in the distribution of a vaccine when that vaccine becomes available. We will need to avoid its distribution across the market becoming a purely commercial, mercantile act in order to allow the poorest countries to access the vaccine for all of their citizens. In Iraq, within the limited resources that we have owing to the circumstances in which we find ourselves, we've combated the pandemic and tried to stem its effects through a series of measures and precautions taken. Despite these efforts, the journey which remains is a long and arduous one. We have limited resources in terms of healthcare, and our healthcare infrastructure is weak, and so our fight is rendered all the more complex. Mr. President, Iraq, both before and after the emergence of this pandemic, was facing another scourge, no less dangerous, that of terrorism and corruption. We succeeded in vanquishing terrorism in military terms. We have freed our cities of terrorism thanks to the sacrifices of our people and of forces, the army and the Peshmerga, for example. We've also done this with the support of the international coalition and the support of our neighbours. Nevertheless, the fight against terrorism is far from over. Transnational extremism continues to exist in the forms of sleeping cells scattered across various parts of our country, including the desert regions. We cannot underestimate the danger represented by terrorism and the possibility that it may re-emerge or that the terrorists may reorganize. We cannot let our guard down when terrorism comes, because if we let our guard down, that will allow obscurantist forces to regroup and gain strength. In the same vein, if we throw in the towel when it comes to fighting against eruption or the interference in the domestic affairs of other states, that will hinder attempts to fight against terrorism and extremism. So we cannot do that. Against this backdrop, we hope that we will receive aid from all friend countries in the international community in order to locate funds and identify sources of corruption which lead to capital flight. And we hope that that will allow us to dry up the sources of financing which fund lawless organisations and extremism. Corruption is a scourge which affects several countries. This corruption has stripped many Iraqis of resources from their own country. It has contributed to the destruction of Iraq for many years. The Iraqi people are deeply bitter when it comes to the impact of corruption. They are angry at the scourge. Last year, when I spoke before this August General Assembly, I launched an appeal for the creation of an international coalition against corruption and for the recovery of pillaged capital, and this modelling the international coalition against terrorism. Today, I renew that same appeal. Indeed, we cannot eradicate terrorism if we do not dry up its financing. That's the only way we can do it. We also need to eradicate corruption, which is the very basis of corrupt policies and of terrorism. Corruption destroys our economies and hinders the will of our people to achieve progress and prosperity. Mr. President, today we must tackle the crimes of genocide and the massacres of the Yazidi people in Iraq. These acts aim to exterminate the Yazidi people. For this reason, the international community must stand shoulder to shoulder with Iraq to ensure that such crimes can never be committed again. A few days ago, I attended a meeting of Iraqi citizens, Yazidi, Turkmen, Shiite and Shabak citizens specifically, and women that survived barbaric acts and the atrocities of terrorism. I heard them express speechless pain that they continue to suffer more than 3 years after the liberation of their cities. These women continue to suffer the psychological and physical consequences of the crimes of genocide, forced displacement, torture, physical and moral torture that is visited upon their people. They continue to live in camps. It is for this reason that we must strive to ensure the return of displaced persons and refugees to their towns and villages. Doing that will require great effort from both us and from our friends and from this august international organization. Mr. President, Iraq brings with it a tradition of more than 40 years of war, suffering, blockades and terrorism. That's the lamentable history we carry. We have suffered more recently from the plummeting oil prices on the global market and from the consequences of the economic havoc wrought by COVID-19. These phenomena have meant that we've had to face major challenges. And these challenges arrived before us at dizzying speed. Around a year ago, Iraq also saw a popular movement in which our citizens expressed a desire for change which would allow Iraqi aspirations to be met. They wanted more dialogue regarding how the country's affairs were managed and regarding their rights. Reforms were undertaken following this social unrest, but we need time to achieve the desired results. However, measures already underway are demonstrating that peaceful change is entirely possible. Within a constitutional framework, violence is not necessary. Indeed, such peaceful change is that which Iraqis wish to see. Against this backdrop, a new government was formed this year. It is a government presided by Mustafa al-Kadhimi, and the formation of that government was a response to the request of the popular uprisings calling for reform. Following our experience of authoritarianism in Iraq, we can now say that the current situation, the status quo, cannot continue. The Iraqi people wish to usher in a new political age so that they can fight against structural imbalances which exist since 2003 when it comes to Iraqi power mechanisms. They want good governance. They want the new government to shoulder lofty responsibilities. We need, however, structural reforms in the political, economic and management spheres. We must combat corruption and corrupt individuals that are another facet of the terrorist scourge. Among the tasks which the new government must discharge is the holding of early elections next year. These are elections which must be free and transparent within the framework of a new electoral law. These elections need to be more representative and fairer, and as such will meet the requests of major national popular uprisings and will meet the Iraqis' aspirations and their desire for democracy. Iraqi people aspire to live a decent life. Iraqis must speak, must express their desires, and the government must work to preserve the interests of Iraqis, to listen to these desires, to listen to their requests and to meet them. The government is also called upon to ensure that it has a monopoly over weapons by preventing the use of weapons in any unlawful contexts. Weapons must remain in the hands of Iraqi state institutions. We must also continue our inquiries into crimes committed against activists and protesters. The fight against lawless bodies and arms control form part of a tireless struggle waged by the Iraqi state. We are facing anarchic bodies, extremist elements. Our challenges are difficult ones, but we must get to work and continue to strive in order to achieve peace within our societies and achieve Iraqi sovereignty. The last communique released by the Shiite Supreme Authority, represented by Ayatollah Sistani, following the meeting that he had with the representative of the Secretary General in Iraq, emphasized these various tasks which the Iraqi government must complete so that the country can be rid of corruption and of all weaknesses that plague it. With that in mind, we hope to receive United Nations support as in terms of its coordination with the electoral authorities. We hope to receive from the UN technical assistance for this body, which will guarantee fair elections which will mean that we do not undermine the freedom of Iraqi citizens. Mr. President, our national project is to affirm the rule of law and its supremacy, and to uphold our commitments to our citizens. We do not want Iraq to become a sort of playground for other forces which will kill themselves on our territory. We have witnessed enough wars and enough attacks on our sovereignty. An independent Iraq and a sovereign Iraq is a country in which all interests of all citizens can be protected. It is a state which will be able to protect the region and to guarantee economic cooperation between all members and to fight against terrorism and extremism. For all of these reasons, we hope to count on effective support from our neighbours so that we can successfully conclude this national project. It will have a positive impact on the future of Iraq and the region, if not, and indeed, on the entire world. Here, we reiterate our position on the need for a resolution of the Palestinian question. We must respond to the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people by creating an independent state so we can preserve the security and the peace of the whole world. Ladies and gentlemen, let us today recall our martyrs that have sacrificed their life for freedom and for the fight against terrorism. I commend our young people who prove day after day their determination to live in freedom and dignity. Let us together look towards the future. Let us continue to support our young people as they walk the path of freedom, rule of law, sovereignty and justice. To conclude, we renew our gratitude and our thanks to the United Nations as we mark the organization's 75th anniversary. There is no alternative to the United Nations, this organization that brings us together despite our differences. It's our only option. It brings us together at a time when we're facing transnational crises such as the pandemic, climate change, problems linked to food security, and the issue of migration. All of these issues can only be dealt with through the United Nations and its charter. There is no doubt whatsoever that the global order has failed over the last 75 years in a number of ways. We have witnessed extreme pain, the genocide in Rwanda, war and massacres that the Iraqi people have suffered. We've witnessed the crisis that continues in Syria and that in Libya. We must learn the lessons of the past. We must ensure the Sustainable Development Goals can evolve, and we must strive for reform within the United Nations so that the organization can meet our people's aspirations. Thank you for your kind attention. We pray to the Almighty God that our next meeting will be held in a pandemic-free world, but also a world free of any other viruses such as hatred, corruption, war and terrorism. May the peace of God be with you. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Iraq for the statement just made. I now give the floor